Hi folks, today we're going to talk about the most interesting and most important molecule in your whole body. It's such an important molecule that every living organism has this molecule in every single cell in their bodies. Most of us just call this cell, the molecule DNA, which is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. This molecule contains the genetic information for every cell in your body. This information tells the cell all sorts of things. It tells the cell what to do. It tells the cell where to go. It tells it what kind of proteins to make and where to put those proteins. Those proteins add together eventually to make tissues and organs which create your whole body. But within the DNA molecule, there's information about what color your eyes should be, or what color your hair should be, or whether you have a genetic disposition to have certain diseases like diabetes or cystic fibrosis. It's taken many years and many different scientists to come up with today's current understanding of what DNA looks like. It all started in 1866 with a monk named Gregor Mendel, who was studying pea plants and how they reproduced. And he noticed that when he put certain types of plants together, green ones together or tall ones together, they only had certain types of offspring. Either they were all green or all tall, or only a certain percentage were tall. And he had theorized that maybe within our cells, as we reproduce, there are certain traits or factors that he called them. They get passed on to offspring. And later in around 1952, a very famous scientist named Rosalind Franklin was the very first to obtain a picture of what DNA looks like through X-ray diffraction. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick determined and published a paper on the structure of what DNA looks like. It's called the double helix, and we'll talk about that in a second. In 1961, there was a scientist that started cracking the genetic code and understanding how the DNA makes up our genes. 1984, there was some experiments on fingerprinting and how DNA affects your fingerprints. And around 2000, this is a really big deal, there was the Human Genome Project, which set out to map every single important piece of information in one human strand of DNA. And they finally finished that project. They had the whole DNA molecule mapped out and what parts are important and play what roles in certain things. The first question you might ask is, where is our DNA stored? Well, for eukaryotes, which means we have a nucleus in our cell. If you remember learning about cells, our DNA is stored somewhere within that nucleus. For a prokaryote, which is a little different, they do not have a nucleus in their cell. That DNA is just floating around as it wishes. The second question you might ask is, what does DNA look like? Well, we already mentioned the double helix structure for DNA. Basically, it looks like a ladder that's been all twisted up. The outer parts of the ladder is made up of sugars and phosphates, and the inner part is made up of bases, or base pairs. The simplest structure within a molecule of the DNA is called a nucleotide. These nucleotides are made up of one sugar, one base, and one phosphate. The bases attached to the sugar, and the four bases we have, are adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. We usually just abbreviate them A, T, C, and G. In the middle, between the sugar-phosphate backbone of this DNA molecule, those bases pair up together. A and T are really good buddies. They like to be together, and C and G like to be together. That's the only combination that we get. Depending on the order that A, T, C, and G are sequenced within our DNA molecule, that becomes like our genetic code. It becomes basically like the zeros and ones of a computer code. and it gives us all of the information that we need. So as we're looking at a picture of a molecule of DNA, this is just a very short section of the DNA. A DNA strand is extremely long. So if you took a section of this DNA out, there might be just this part of it is responsible for what color your eyes are. And maybe this chunk of the DNA is responsible for your hair color. And et cetera, et cetera. Each of those chunks of DNA that are responsible for different things, those are what we call genes. Now, of course, when we're talking about eye color, maybe you could have brown eyes, or blue eyes, or green eyes. There's all sorts of different types of colors of eyes that you could have. The different ways that that gene can be coded for your eyes, those are called alleles. So we have a gene that's a section of a DNA, and each different way a gene could be coded, or the different information that a gene could give out, those are called alleles. So if in my molecule I said that the blue bases here were A, and the yellow ones were T, and the pink ones are C, and the green ones are G, we could read out the code for this DNA. So as we read from one side to the other, usually from left to right, we get A, C, T, T, that's green, you can't really tell, G, T, G, A, etc., etc. And this is what the code looks like when we write it out on paper. It's just a string of letters. And automatically we know, since A always goes with T, the other side of this molecule has a T there. The other side of this molecule has a G here, or an A here. So there are multiple different forms DNA can take. The very, at the molecular level, we call this the double helix shape. And that's just if we're zoomed in very close to it. And then our cells have a life cycle you may have learned about called mitosis. And at different stages of the mitosis, or any type of cell cycle that a cell might go through, there are different forms that DNA can take. So most of the time that a cell is growing and carrying out normal functions, the DNA is kind of like spaghetti. It's just in loose strands all floating around, no big deal. Within the nucleus, of course. And we call that chromatin. Or the loose form of DNA. As the cell enters prophase, the first step of mitosis, the nuclear membrane starts to break down. And the DNA inside that nucleus, instead of being in a loose spaghetti form of DNA, it starts to compact and coil around very tightly around a bunch of little proteins. And that's what we call a chromosome. Or the tight form, the compacted form. And that chromosome will copy itself, and each piece of this chromosome is called a chromatid, or chromatid.